Welcome to the Impact Learning Visionaries podcast, where we celebrate the unsung heroes of the learning and development industry. As always, we'll be bringing some laughter and a bit of fun along the way, but more importantly, you'll get some incredible insights, key lessons, and unique perspectives on everything related and possibly unrelated to training and development. Let's get this show on the road. Hello everybody and welcome to the Impact Learning Visionaries podcast. Today we are joined by Donna Ward-Higgs, who has over 2 decades of experience in coaching and facilitation, as well as people development. She holds numerous accreditations in these areas and is the founder and chief doer of Learning Partner Solutions, an organization specializing in developing emotionally intelligent leaders and teams to cultivate a spirit of learning and confidence. She firmly believes in the power of growth mindsets and emotional intelligence and how, when combined, the two superpowers can radically transform personal and team well-being and organizational success. Donna, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, just before we started, you mentioned something which I think is a great way to start the conversation. You said learning is a superpower.
Yes.
Why do you believe learning is a superpower?
I think it's the thing that makes the biggest difference in everybody's life. When you can tap it, well, we've all got it, right? We've all got the ability to learn. We do it day in, day out, often unconsciously, without even thinking about it. It makes the difference in everything that we do, everything that we want to do. All of the things that we want to achieve, all of the actions that we want to take, being open to the fact that change is constant, things don't always go to plan, no plan survives contact. The ability to learn, to embrace that ability to learn, is a superpower. When you can harness that superpower of learning, you are unstoppable. There's nothing that can stand in your way when it comes to change and achievement and development and results. Learning underpins all of that.
And I mean, almost in contrary to that is this kind of growing belief that the next superpower is our ability to unlearn and relearn. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, they're two sides of the same coin, right? If we're continually learning, if we're tapping into this superpower of learning, it means we're questioning and challenging everything we think we already know. It's recognizing that we each have our own unique perspective and worldview. And that's just one piece of the puzzle, because we live in a socially constructed society where no man is an island. We don't work in isolation. As humans, we're social creatures. And so as we encounter each other's unique worldview and perspective, there's going to be some challenge. There's going to be some disagreement. That's beautiful, fertile ground for where you go next.
Brilliant. And I mean, just looking at the past year, you know, I mean, we're kind of coming into the new year, coming into 2024. From a learning kind of perspective, what do you think some of the biggest aha moments, the biggest challenges, the biggest insights are that you've kind of observed over the last year?
I think we're in a real period of change at the moment. I think there's an undercurrent in the narrative about what life looks like, what's possible, and what no longer serves us. And I think, so if I look at it first of all from my own journey across 2023, there were moments of huge celebration. There's learning in that. There were also moments of epic failure, and there's even more learning in that. If we then take that onto the more global stage, we're still feeling the effects of the dreaded C word, right? COVID, we may have passed that period of intense lockdown, but I think the turbulence that created is something that we're still feeling. And with all of the discussions around hybrid working, mandating a return to the office, thinking about job titles and what learning and development and talent needs to look like as we go forward. There's a recognition that what's gone before is perhaps no longer fit for purpose. It's a time where we're rebuilding and reimagining what good looks like. And I think a lot of conversations around that are really opening up some new avenues. The advent of the rise of AI, the use of technology in the work that we're doing is just one example of how the playing field has changed. Those parameters are constantly shifting and moving. And it comes back to learning being a superpower, because you've got to keep pace with all of those narratives, with all of those changes, with taking that into your consciousness and working out what to do with it in terms of your own personal circumstances, the team that you might be in, the organisation that you're part of, the wider society that you sit within. It has a ripple effect across all of that.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. And the one constant is always going to be change. And I think, this is definitely I suppose a space that is probably going to be radically affected by change, especially over the next couple of years. And even probably in many aspects has already started. The change has already started. So you kind of alluded to, kind of imagining what it would look like almost visualizing that in your head. What do you think the future of learning looks like?
I think there's definitely a move towards more individualized learning. And I think that's a real positive. I think more needs to be done in recognising the everyday learning opportunities that we interact with. When we watch something, when we hear something, when we have a conversation, when we experience something, all of that, there's learning taking place. And I think doing more to talk about and celebrate those everyday learning opportunities will help to build it into the fabric of creating a learning culture. I think there's a real ambition within organisations to have more of a learning culture. And I think organisations are recognising more the power of the individual to influence the collective. So I think taking a moment to really bring our awareness to those everyday learning opportunities, the more informal learning that we take for granted, to talk about that more is really powerful. And I think from that there's the opportunity there to cultivate, to curate resources to share those learning opportunities. And I believe awareness is choice. Right? When we bring our awareness to what we're doing, we open up that choice. Do I want to continue on the same path? Do I want to do something different? So I think igniting that spark of being conscious in our learning opportunities is something that I'd love to see embraced a lot more. It's been for a long time that training is an event, often a tick box exercise. Yep, you've been on the training, you must know how to do that, which completely negates all of the other parts that go into learning, right? There's a process that we follow when we go through learning. So being aware in the first instance, cultivating those conversations, creating those spaces where those conversations can take place, having those spaces and resources available for people to share and discuss and disseminate whatever's coming from those experiences feels really important. That's not to say training as an event doesn't have its place, but it's what's done either side of that. So how are people preparing themselves for a learning opportunity? Then there's thinking about the experience in itself and what's done to support the reflection from that, to really draw out what did it mean for you, what were your takeaways, how are you going to use that and apply that going back into whatever you're doing. having some space to bring diversity of thought to planning. So having gone through that experience, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to make sure that not only do we transform thinking, but that translates into action? And then how do we create the conditions where people can experiment? Because another key part of learning is making mistakes. And I think that's also a bold change, to be more transparent, to be more open, to embrace where things have gone wrong, because there's learning in that, because there's a chance to take some learning from that and to do it differently next time, or not. But if we're not putting the time into that thinking, that talking, that discussion, that planning, that experimentation, we stay in the place of training being a one-off event to tick a box. And it doesn't create tangible change. That's where organisations often, when budgets are tight, learning is the thing that goes, because from a mindset point of view, it's seen as this thing that happens. People go, we can tick the box. But actually, in not thinking broader than that, we take away those opportunities for learning to be an ongoing evolution in our day-to-day work.
There's a heck of a lot to unpack in what you've just said, but
sorry, brain dump.
I've got about 14 different questions, but I'm not going to ask all of them. The one that probably stands out the most, because I come across it all the time, is you talked about learning. We learn best when we learn through failure, and I'm just curious, as historically there hasn't been a lot of appetite for mistakes and failures in organizations, and often people are so self-conscious and so self-aware of their failures and actively trying to avoid them, that I'm wondering, have you seen a change in just the kind of philosophy around learning through mistakes in organizations? Are people still petrified to make mistakes? Are organizations still intolerant of mistakes and failures? Or are you seeing more accommodation for mistakes and failures?
So before I answer that, I don't know that mistakes are the best way to learn, but they're another opportunity for learning. And the tough stuff is often where the biggest lessons are. I think there's a shift in narrative. I think people are talking about that side of things more. I don't know that as yet that's translating into action. I think that's a real aspiration for me. I worked alongside an organisation across the whole of 2023. We did a full staff learning programme with a leadership development pathway. And as part of that, when we were putting together the programme, we looked at how we could bring people together from cross-location, cross-functional, different levels within the organisation to really have great diversity of thought in the room. And one of the things that came up time and time again in those conversations was around that fear of failure, that fear of mistakes, the fear of consequences, the fears around how it's perceived by others. And what really struck me is when you cultivate the right conditions for those conversations to take place, they're hugely empowering. Often our perception isn't true, right? The fears that we have about what will happen if we get that wrong, or that we admit that we got that wrong, aren't necessarily the reality, but the conversations don't happen around what that looks like. And I think so it's nice to see the narrative change, and it's nice to see the conversations opening up. I think that's a necessary step to move towards more openness, more transparency, and more of embracing those opportunities.
And you mentioned there when the conditions were right. So what are we looking for in terms of knowing when the conditions are right? What does it look like?
So I think it's really important to cultivate psychological safety. People feeling valued, people feeling heard, seen, people having the opportunity to do their thinking out loud I think that's often what we're afraid of with those mistakes. I don't want to say something stupid. I don't want people to think bad of me. But there are such nuggets in those conversations, such pearls of wisdom when people feel safe enough to be able to ask the question that they think is a silly question, or admit that they don't know or don't know where to start or are afraid to take that first next step. Because in that first admission of vulnerability, there's the opportunity to build even greater rapport, even stronger working relationships. And really, that's at the heart of what we're fearful of. It goes back to that prehistoric brain programming around being part of the tribe, feeling safe, feeling belonging, feeling acceptance. So I think when it comes to creating those conditions, you can never underestimate the power of psychological safety. And sometimes that's around hierarchy, position, sometimes that's around organisational values and culture, the way that we do things. Sometimes that's around confidence, experience, knowledge. So I think there's an element of having a level playing field in the room, recognising that each person in the room is first and foremost a human being. We all have that common starting point. And actually, when we can come together as humans, rather than as a director or a manager or a leader or a whatever, leveling that playing field can be really powerful. I think as well, thinking about how responses are handled and managed. Like, we all respond to the things we see and hear, and again, from our own personal perspective and worldview, taking a moment to recognise that our brain is naturally judgmental, and in bringing our awareness to that, having the choice to notice it and then choose what we do with it. So choosing to hold that space for those people in that moment for the benefit of what might come from the conversation.
Sure. I
think those are really powerful.
Yeah. I mean, the judgmental thing is a really interesting observation, because I think I'm wondering how many people will acknowledge and admit that your brain is actually naturally very judgmental. But even so, I guess, part of the challenge is so many organizations today almost kind of reward speed of execution, how quickly something's done. Like, we've got no time for pontificating or messing around. Like, we reward the guys who just get on with it. And it's quite interesting that I wonder how much of that starts to become quite a judgment influence process, because there's just no time and space for that kind of reflection. So
that sparks in me a thought that it's often a misconception. So how many times does something get done quickly and a result is achieved, but you're then clearing up problems afterwards, going back and rectifying mistakes? Or sometimes to slow down is the best way to speed up. And again, one of the things that fascinated me through this learning program was the time taken out to participate was a significant chunk in the working week. But people's reflection on the value they gained from taking themselves out of the hustle and bustle of the day-to-day, having that time and space to think and to talk, having the opportunity to cultivate relationships that in their normal day-to-day, at the pace that things go, that just didn't feel like the time to do. The value of that far outweighs the time taken. And actually, when you look at how that accelerates results through relationships, things are happening faster as a result because of that time that was taken for that to happen. So I think time's a really interesting one. We get so caught up on the milestones of the calendar or the ticking of the clock. has it been the most effective use of time? Did it generate the results that we expected? Was there anything we could have done differently? If we're not investing the time in asking those questions and asking them with a real open curiosity to explore the answers, actually we're doing ourselves and our organisations a disservice. That's where we fall into that space of, because we've always done it that way.
It's such an interesting kind of quagmire or minefield, because often I would argue that the value of questions is undebatable. I mean, there's massive value in questions. The challenge comes in our tolerance for questions and our comfort in getting the answers to the questions that we probably don't want to hear. So yeah, it's a fascinating space. But I'm going to shift a bit back to the original 14 questions. We've got one out the way, so we might be here for a while. But the other one that you mentioned, which has always been fascinating to me, because in technology, the word personalization has been around for 20 plus years, and I've seen it in many different ways, shapes, and forms. And obviously, the nirvana of everything is personalization. It's the all famous question. It's the Johnny Bravo. That's enough about me. Let's talk about me. But in terms of learning, obviously personalization is going to be phenomenal. It's going to be remarkable. But how close do you think we are to realistically seeing personalization coming into the learning space?
I mean, there are moves happening. I think the more people take ownership, because I think that's the other thing that goes hand in hand with this personalisation aspect. People have to take individual ownership and responsibility for that learning being personalised. There has to be an appetite. There has to be some effort. That you have to engage in order for it to work. And I've been in places where there are great resources available and nobody goes near them because of the fast pace and the time and all the rest of it. I also think with the personalisation thing, it's still only one facet. So going back to remembering that we're social creatures, so much of the value is then in how you construct that with the others that you discuss it with, that you reflect on it with. And so I don't think personalisation in the purest form that I'm now thinking about it is actually what I think is the answer. I think that personal onus, that personal ownership is really important, but it always needs to come back to how does that serve the collective, and that can be on a number of different levels. But I think to take one or the other misses a huge chunk of what's crucial to learning. We are social creatures and we create the reality that we live in through our interactions with others. So I think they always have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, so I think the idea about personal ownership really resonates with me. I think I've given that advice to so many people now. I've probably I'll look very much like a broken record. But I always give it in the context of it's a hard world we live in, and nobody is going to care as much about your career and your future as you will. So it's in your best interest to take ownership of your own learning and your own career. But looking at it from the other perspective, I would imagine that's difficult because, I guess learning and development managers have historically, kind of been facilitators, finding out what the needs of the organization are, fulfilling those needs. And when this personalization conversation or personal ownership conversation comes into play, they start having to change a bit of their kind of modus operandi, where they go from facilitators maybe to orchestrators, helping to get the best out of all of the moving parts of the orchestra, kind of your thoughts on that? I mean, is that something that you see being kind of part of the future? Do you see it? Is it happening? How realistically do you even go and do that inside an organization?
Yeah, it really resonates. I think that if you take that aspect of L&D managers and the idea of training need analysis or setting the organisational plan, you've got to involve the stakeholders. You've got to involve the people that are part of this. And so often the mistake is made in focusing at one end of the spectrum. Right, let's talk to the senior leadership team. They've set the direction. Let's see what they think is important. They're often so far removed from the front line that actually it's disparate. Or organisations that go to the front line and ask what's important, perhaps that connection to the vision, the strategy, the direction of travel is missing. So I think finding a way and not just finding a way, actually, making it the norm that everybody contributes to establishing what's important, what's going to make the biggest difference, what matters most. I think thinking not only about the organisation's direction of travel, but how that organisation will nurture its people and provide enough opportunities for them to feel valued and nurtured within that space that they continue to show up and give their best feels really important. So I think a lot more co-creation feels really valuable, and I'd love to see much more so where I'm asked to put forward proposals or I see opportunities come out and it's send us all these details on what you think should happen and here's some information about our values and our mission and our vision, and that should be enough to get on with. I'd love more opportunity to talk to some of those key stakeholders about the difference that they want to see and what that means in reality, what that means in the day-to-day, what that means in the gaps that currently exist and why it's important that those gaps are filled, so that there's much more information seeking but also collaboration at that really early stage, so that the buy-in and engagement is there because people have had an input in saying what's most important. Because wherever this happens, and I've been part of a couple of organisations where they've opened up that whole organisation conversation, what you find is the themes that come through run through. It's not that you've got however many thousand disparate ideas and thoughts and directions of travel. There are key themes. But if you're not asking the question, and you're not asking the question at all levels of all stakeholders, you're going to be missing something. You're going to be missing that opportunity to make real difference to what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think that's the big part of the challenge is, whether you're building a product that's going to go to market, whether you're building a business, you want to involve all of the stakeholders. I think obviously the big challenge for people in organizations is the bandwidth versus expectations kind of curve, and thinking, do I really honestly have time to do all of that every single time I want to do a learning initiative? Kirsty, what would you say to someone who had that kind of I suppose mindset?
It is a mindset thing. It absolutely is a mindset thing. And it's whether you want the results for here and now or the results for sustainability. It's how you want to future-proof yourself. It's how you want to prepare yourself to go forward. And that's about how you set the tone. This comes back to culture. This comes back to what type of organisation are you? What type of organisation do you want to be? What do you want the people within your organisation to go on to say about you, whether they're in there now or they're moving on from that? Time and energy are finite resources. We can't magic up more of them. So we have to think about how we use them most effectively. Time's going to march on regardless, right? So do you want a tick box exercise that you're going to repeat time and time and time again and always go, it didn't quite hit the mark, so-and-so wasn't satisfied, we need to tweak and change this? Over that amount of time, Is that any different to putting the time in front loaded to ask the right questions, to get the information, to build that buy-in and engagement, to deliver a result that is going to make that change and be sustainable? So you're going to use the time anyway.
Yeah.
But how do you want to use it? You're going to use those resources. You're going to use that budget. But do you want to keep forking out, hoping that the next thing will be the magic pill? Or do you want to really take time to co-create that and not just talk the talk about your people being important, but walk the walk in actually getting them actively involved in the co-creation of the learning that's going to make a difference?
Completely agree. I want to come back almost to the introduction, and because we kind of explored this concept around mindsets, and I know that you are a firm believer in growth mindsets inside the organization, and now this is the really fascinating thing. If somebody pulled me, I mean, I've had conversations about growth mindsets for more years than I can imagine. But if anybody ever pulled me aside, put a gun to my head and said, give me a definition of what a growth mindset is, I'd probably end up with two in the back of the head.
Extreme.
Yeah, well, it's such a difficult, I mean, I can conceptualize it. I can basically rationalize it. But it's such a difficult thing to define and explain in a very kind of I suppose, concrete way. What is your kind of understanding and definition of a growth mindset?
I think it comes back to that tagline of learning being a superpower. For me, a growth mindset is the belief that you can learn. And in your ability to learn, you can affect change. I think a fixed mindset is to say that there are parameters everywhere that you can't do anything about. So a growth mindset is recognizing where you have some power and some control to influence, to impact. And I think that sits within our ability to learn, whether that's through knowledge, theory, experience. Yeah, I think a growth mindset is about embracing our ability to learn, and in learning, giving us the power and the control to affect the conditions we find ourselves within.
Okay. And I mean, in terms of kind of critical thinking and complexity and being able to understand and navigate, I mean, I think if we were looking at organizations 20 years ago compared to today, as human beings, we haven't fundamentally, grown bigger brains or adapted, but the organizations around us have definitely become far more complex and far more challenging. Now, I've also heard kind of growth mindset used in that kind of frame or context is that ability to be able to almost kind of using brain plasticity or whatever the kind of right neuroscience terminology is, to be able to adapt and navigate those complex environments as well. Is there an element to that as well?
Yeah, so as we encounter something, we take that experience in and we work out what that means for us. And if we proceed from the point of it happened and there's nothing I can do about it, it's just going to happen again, we're in that fixed mindset place. Growth mindset is going, this happened, what have I taken from that? Where's the opportunity? Where's the challenge? And how am I going to navigate that? How am I going to minimize that? How am I going to eliminate that? We're learning, right? In doing that, we're going through that process of learning instead of accepting the assumption that it just is. We challenge that. We get curious. We ask questions. We tap into that hunger to know more, to not believe the constraints presented to us, or to not be afraid to ask how much of a constraint they actually are. So I think it stands true on an individual and an organisational level. And I think that's why we've seen such a rise in entrepreneurism right? People going, I'm not so sure it has to be that way, or I can see there's a way to do it better, or there's a gap there, we're missing something. That's learning in action. That's I've hit this brick wall and I don't accept that this brick wall isn't movable. And maybe it's brick by brick that I have to take it apart. Maybe I go over, maybe I go round, maybe I go under. But it's that willingness not to challenge, to look for those alternatives.
I mean, it's always kind of appeared to me as if there's there's not enough people with a growth mindset in organizations. But if you're saying that it almost seems not to be the case because of the rise of entrepreneurship is evidence that people are challenging the status quo, finding that they're not happy with the status quo and going and basically forging their own path. So is it, I guess that it's a really interesting question, is the problem that there isn't enough people with growth mindsets, or is it the problem that actually organizations, just by nature of the way that they are, don't encourage growth mindsets?
I think there's definitely a piece of the latter. Absolutely. And we see that in turnover rates, sickness rates, engagement rates. And it's interesting to watch as organisations grow how that can be squashed more. So that transition from a small to medium enterprise into that growth space really does seem to have an impact on how much individual thought, how much challenge is allowed to be brought, how much that's welcomed. I think that's where those time pressures become even more of a barrier. I think there's less effort put into the cohesion of the parts as things grow, and I think that's where growth mindset gets squashed.
Which is, I mean, it's both understandable and kind of say intriguing. Is I get when organizations start to scale and grow, they look for algorithms. They look for repeatable process, because as an organization you need to scale, and you don't want to go and try and reinvent the wheel. In fact, many times in my career I've been criticized of trying to reinvent the wheel. But at the same time, there's a balance, because yes, you don't want to kind of keep disrupting, but at the same time you want to see operational optimization, and there's an opportunity of growth mindset even within those algorithms. But yet we don't see enough of that. We don't see organizations kind of constantly encouraging people to challenge the status quo. It's like, okay, we have X amount of capacity to kind of think, and that thing has now been dealt with. Let's put it outside of our little box, and we don't want to hear about, kind of some guy who's got some harebrained scheme to make that thing even more efficient. So in those types of organizations, how do you kind of bring that growth mindset back into the DNA of the organization?
There's a few things what you've said there has thrown up for me. The first is for you to have received that feedback many times, it hasn't deterred you at any point. So I'm curious about. I'm very stubborn. The second thing is around challenge, and it's an interesting concept and a word I'd like to see used more. Quite often the requests for training around conflict management, conflict resolution. I think conflict is a really bad word to use for what we're talking about here, because what we're talking about is the ability to challenge, the ability to consider an alternative perspective alongside your own and find a better way forward with both of those perspectives in play. And I think it's the challenge aspect that gets shut down. I think going back to what you said earlier about all of those fears that come to play, and one of the biggest being challenges to authority. I think there's a need to remove ego from hierarchy. I think, and this is where my work around emotional intelligence feels really important. We've got to be aware. We've got to be aware of who we are, how we show up, and the impact we have on others. We've got to be open to our own learning within that. And if we're open to learning, challenge has its place. And I'm not saying challenge for challenge's sake. It's not about I just don't like you, or I don't like what you're saying and I'm going to challenge that. It's about challenge to that modus operandi. Does it work? Is it effective? What does good look like? What does success mean? Where are there opportunities to do better? How could we do more? How could we think about this differently? I think if we can start to find the right language to use, I think that's an important shift, because language creates our reality. And I think building on that aspect of emotional intelligence, self-awareness, seeing challenge as another opportunity for growth, an opportunity to find out something you don't already know. We've all got blind spots, deaf spots, dumb spots, right? If we're not open to having those challenged, if we're not open to seeing alternative perspectives, we're missing out. And then we can only operate in the space of, because we've always done it this way. The third thing that came to mind within that is the spectrum between management and leadership. And they're often talked about as separate things. Job titles are arranged and they're separate things. They're not, they're a spectrum. And they're two sides of the same coin, in the sense that on the one hand, we need to optimize. We need to operationalize. We need things to be standardized, because that gives us a level of security and stability from which we can be safe to experiment. We know the parameters, we know the boundaries. But we've also got to have that vision, that desire, that ambition to want to do better in whatever that remit we're playing in might be. So whether it's for customers, whether it's for business results, whether it's for our people, whether it's for the culture that we create, there has to be that desire for continuous improvement. And most businesses would argue they have that, right? They're striving to continuously improve, whatever numbers you put on it. So if you want improvement, you've got to be open to seeing the alternatives, because that innovation sits in that space of what you don't already know.
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount of complexity in that very kind of succinct statement of yours. I think, and I can empathize with all sides. I think, yes, organizations would say they're continuously improving, but then why are there so many organizations that I observe that are 30, 40 years old, but they're actually 3 or 4 years old 10 times over? The desire doesn't always equal outcome, and I think that's why it's such a fascinating space, and why the people space is such a fascinating space to be in, because there are no easy answers, there are no silver bullets. It's just hard work, consistency, and showing up every day, and putting in the hard yards.
Absolutely. And it's always remembering that individuals influence the collective. So it's remembering all the moving parts, and people are difficult, right? We're really complex as humans. There's no one size fits all. So I think curiosity plays a really big part in all of that. But yeah, there's no straightforward answer.
Yeah, so sadly not, but I think that's part of the reason why it's such a fascinating space to be in, and why it requires a growth mindset to be successful in, because you're always having to challenge your norms and your status quos. Right, just kind of end off, because coming to kind of close, always end off with 2 questions. One is just a very practical, kind of pragmatic question, which I think is in this case, it's, we've talked about the growth mindset. We've talked about what's needed to encourage more growth mindsets. We've talked about psychological safety. So I think you've given a lot of practical advice that people can use. So I'm going to kind of flip this question and say, looking forward from 2023 into 2024, as someone in learning and development, what do you think the biggest, besides obvious answer to this being learning, but the biggest kind of superpower that people can, in learning and development, can have to navigate the complexities that they're going to start facing in 2024?
Curiosity. You don't have to know the answer. You don't have to be responsible for the answer, but you do have to be curious. You have to be willing to ask. You have to be willing to listen. You have to be willing to be challenged. You have to be a role model in that as well. You go first.
And for someone who doesn't think they may be curious, how do you kind of teach yourself to be curious?
Oh, that's a great question. I think a really simple one. Take an everyday object and challenge yourself to look at it differently. Right, you've got the vase on the mantelpiece that you pass every day, so much so that you've stopped seeing it. So set yourself a timer for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and really look at that object. What do you see? What feelings does it evoke? How does the light touch it? What are the colours? Get curious about something you're familiar with that you've taken for granted. And then take from that experience into your day.
Oh, that's such a great answer. I will never look at a vase the same way ever again. The second question is, we always ask our guests on the show for a book, podcasts, anything that's kind of given them some kind of emotional response or sense of awe, to share it with everybody.
So I've got the book that I took on holiday with me, How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett. So I read this a couple of weeks ago and it was fascinating. So really thinking about emotions as constructed, understanding how our brain works with our body budgeting system, and how we then label the feelings that come from those processes, and how those labels interact with others in our life, and what that means for what we then do with those emotions. I found it really, really interesting for a number of reasons, but the thing that resonated most was being able to gain some space, some distance from emotions. Emotions can often take over, and we've talked today about challenge and growth mindset and why people avoid that or might be resistant. I think this book gives a great perspective on looking at those emotional responses differently and giving yourself the power of the pause to choose what you do with those next.
Good luck to all the extroverts out there. I think you just described basically nirvana for introverts, but an absolute nightmare for an extrovert.
I'm a huge extrovert, and I loved that book, and that was the thinking it prompted in me. So, who knows?
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really fascinating conversation. I think there's so many useful tips and suggestions, so really appreciate you sharing them with us, and hoping that 2024 is a fantastic year for everybody in learning and development, and that everybody can tap into their superpower, which is learning.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Jason. It's been great talking to you.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Impact Learning Visionaries. If you found it interesting or helpful, please subscribe by clicking on the button down below so you don't miss our next one. Also, be sure to check out our Reality Bites blog for more information on how technology is aiding in learning development. Links are all in the description below. Go check it out. Thanks a lot. Bye.